Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Wednesday lunchtime reflection from St. Peter Mancroft Church. I'm sorry I'm starting a bit late, but we've had technology problems. My name's Gill Persicke, and I'm one of the licensed lay ministers in this church. And my little talk today is a question, which is, how much do you think you're in control of your own mind? I'm getting a chuckle from the body of the church, which is lovely. I think we're all aware at times of how much the external world influences us. I remember coming out of the movie Billy Elliot and almost dancing down the street. A feel-good movie really does what it promises, doesn't it? It makes you feel good. And other things, of course, have the exact opposite effect on us. Waking up to weather which feels more like autumn than summer has definitely been lowering my spirits recently, and I know I'm not alone in this. Both of these observations of mine are simple common sense, of course, things which we'll all be aware of. Nothing new here. But do we really know just how much the external world influences us? Perhaps we're being affected much more than we realise all the time and completely unconsciously by almost everything that's going on around us. I'd like to describe for you a famous psychological experiment which was done in America in 1996. It's known as the Florida effect experiment for reasons which will become clear. The researchers worked with two groups of students, and they started by giving them a word game to do. The students were given pools of words out of which they had to construct coherent sentences. Straightforward enough. Group A had vocabulary chosen completely at random, but the word pools given to Group B included some words which you might associate with old age. Words like forgetful, bald, grey, wrinkled, and yes, the word Florida, which is well known in the United States as a retirement destination. The word old itself didn't actually appear in the word pools. And when the students had finished the word game, they were told that there was a second part to the experiment, which was going to take place in another room at the far end of quite a long corridor. What the students didn't know was that the corridor itself was the key part of the experiment, because the researchers timed very accurately how long it took each student to walk down that corridor. And lo and behold, the students from Group B, who'd been working with the age-related words, walked down the corridor more slowly. The difference was really significant, statistically significant. It seemed that merely by being exposed to words about old age, that it had the power to make young, fit, healthy volunteers a bit more elderly in their functioning, temporarily. When the researchers questioned the participants afterwards, two things became apparent. First, none of the Group B students had actually noticed that there were any old age words in their word game. And secondly, they were completely astounded, indeed they were disbelieving that such a thing could possibly have made them walk more slowly. They hadn't been aware of it, and they didn't believe it. The experiment I've just described, which of course has had its critics, fair enough, that experiment was one of the first to demonstrate something which is now generally known as priming. The way in which exposure to a particular stimulus, in this case words, can unconsciously affect what someone does or says or feels thereafter. Another experimental example. Students were given word pools to play with, which included words associated with either aggression, or patience, or positivity. 3 different groups of students. They were then made to wait for a very long time for their results. And I suspect you can guess by now what happened. The students who'd been primed with the aggressive words got much more frustrated by the wait than the patience and the positivity students. Knowing this about the human brain, of course, suggests that we might exploit this mechanism. That's what human beings do. And the ways in which priming has indeed been exploited raises big ethical questions. Take advertising, for example. It works. I only have to see on the telly an attractive advert for chocolate to be sent scampering to my kitchen in search of a sweet treat. And if there's no chocolate around, I have to make do with something else sweet. But yeah, chocolate does go on my shopping list for the very next day. There was a huge debate several decades ago now about subliminal advertising on telly. You know, quickly flashing an image of a product on screen too fast for the conscious mind to notice it, but nonetheless priming the human brain to desire that particular product. This kind of subliminal advertising is now, of course, banned in most countries, quite rightly, because we understand that priming people's brains in a way which is completely hidden from them is deeply unethical. But what about the priming that goes on in a much more subtly disguised fashion? Let me describe to you something called political media priming. The newsroom of any media company, telly, radio, print press, whatever, that newsroom has a huge number of potential stories they could cover. There's a lot going on in the world. And they, of course, have to be selective in what they actually do cover. That's common sense. So, for example, a newsroom decides to focus on an immigration story rather than a climate story. Looks like an innocent enough decision? Well, in doing this, they actually have the most enormous power to prime voters to prioritise immigration over climate when deciding how to vote in the next election, because people vote on the issues which are given most media coverage. Many of us may be struggling to understand what's going on in American politics at the present, how so many American voters seem to have such extraordinary loyalties and such powerful animosities and blind spots. Part of the explanation, part of it, of course, lies with the often very partisan American news media, which are quite deliberately priming voters one way or another with their coverage. Our own BBC may be far from perfect, any human institution is, but I'm very grateful indeed that the Beeb can and is held to account for its news coverage, both by public and by politicians. And now let's tiptoe onto very thin ice here. What about the priming which takes place in religious circles? Most contemporary Christians will be aware that you can defend completely opposing opinions. You can defend both of those opinions by referring selectively to one part of the Bible or another. And if you do this consistently and repeatedly with a whole congregation, you are indeed priming. You're priming a fairly large group of people to be, for example, more or less socially conservative or liberal in their attitudes. Anyone who preaches or teaches within a church context needs to be aware of this considerable power they wield. As do the listeners, of course, the congregation and the voters and the people who watch telly adverts. We do not need to be oblivious, helpless victims of the priming which targets us. Although priming at first sight does seem to take unseen control of our minds, the more we become aware of it as a mechanism and as a tactic, the more we can resist it and truly make our own decisions. Good, ethical, responsible, and in my case, less chocolate-focused decisions. And we can also prime ourselves for the good. First thing in the morning, do you just turn on the news, which, face it, nowadays can be deeply distressing or annoying or frightening even? Or do you perhaps pray a little and nourish your mind with ideas of light and hope and goodness and God? Which of these you choose to do may well determine how welcoming and how relaxed you are with the first person you speak to that day. The choice, I believe, is yours every morning, and mine. Thank you very much for joining us today for this reflection, and I wish you every blessing for the rest of the day.